Hello and welcome again to another edition of Lost in Science. Half an hour on your radio where we talk about all things sciencey. My name's Stu, and this week I'm actually going to be talking about the coolest spacecraft project that you've probably never heard of, the Orion Project. See, you haven't heard of it. You're looking at me blankly.
I mean, Chris is nodding, but I am shaking my head.
Yeah. Well, the Orion Project was cancelled many years ago
many moons ago.
Many moons ago, but they were thinking well beyond the moon. They were thinking of interplanetary travel, but you'll see why they cancelled it pretty quickly when I start talking about it later in the show.
So maybe it's not so cool after all, Steve.
Chris, what have you got for us?
Well, I continuing on from a story that I did a couple of weeks ago now, I think, if you listen to it. I talked about potatoes. Potatoes. And I said I was going to do a bit of a series on
potatoes.
The effect. No, on things like dietary stuff and medical research, the kind of things that make the news and how you make sense of what you believe when you hear about science reports and what you should eat and whether things are bad for you or not. And as part of that, I feel I should actually give a little bit of a mention of what it means when scientists say something is statistically significant.
Has a very specific meaning.
Has a specific meaning, and it has, it's quite complex.
And I will be speaking to a special guest on the program this week, actually about how climate change is going to be affecting our domestic animals. So if you think about your cats, your dogs, then guinea pigs, and then also like stock animals, climate change and how it's going to affect our animals and what we should be looking out for.
Well, what an action-packed show. Stay tuned. The history of space travel is full of incredible sounding projects that never actually got off the ground, so to speak. And when I was a kid, there were still plenty of books floating around libraries showing various versions of them. And the idea of humans traveling to other planets and setting up colonies was pretty much accepted in the mid-20th century as the inevitable next step of human civilization.
We were all supposed to be living in bubbles on the moon by now, I believe.
Well, that's right. The books that I'm thinking of are full of pictures of moon bases and even further flung colonies of humans, usually based on various incarnations of 1950s and 60s technology.
Oh yeah, dogs in spacesuits.
Yeah, with bubble helmets around their head.
Jetsons.
Yeah.
But I recently came across a project many people may not have heard of from the United States, dating from the late 1950s, called the Orion Project. Now, the project was considered as a potential means of putting people on other planets, but not just within our solar system, actually making interstellar travel a possibility. So the Orion Project was based on the potential for using atomic energy, as lots of things were in the 50s. The atomic, the power of the atom was the greatest invention known to humankind, to power giant ships to carry people to Mars or the moons of Saturn, or even to our nearest neighbouring stars. So it was not a very sophisticated system. I mean, in some ways it was, but admittedly, the basic premise was that a ship would sit on top of a stack of atomic bombs. And as each one exploded in sequence, the ship accelerated.
Right.
Well, look, this seemed like a pretty good way to get huge distances back in the late 50s. And the famous physicist Freeman Dyson proposed that such a ship could potentially reach Alpha Centauri in as little as 133 years.
Inventor of the vacuum cleaner. No, it wasn't.
Different Dyson.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is still far too long for any crew to last the journey, and so the idea of generation ships was developed, where a crew would live and raise families on the ship, and their grandchildren or great-grandchildren would eventually be the ones to arrive at their destination.
That's quite a commitment, really.
It is quite a commitment, especially for the people who don't get to commit to it themselves, who are born on the ship and have no choice.
And might decide to just turn it around.
Well, potentially. So the proposed ships were gigantic. The largest one that they proposed would have weighed over 8 million tons and would have been effectively a giant space city. Now, the major drawback, which should be pretty obvious, having a ship that's powered by nuclear explosions at its base, and it's the reason that these ships were never built, was that the nuclear explosions would leave behind them a trail of radioactive fallout. So you would have to launch them from relatively far off in space to avoid spraying the Earth with atomic fallout on your way out.
I guess you could put it
Crop
into a higher
dusting
orbit,
the
like not higher orbit, like you go to actually say to the Martian orbit or something like that.
Or you could potentially leave from the far side of the moon or something like that. I guess it probably there was probably ways around it, but people sort of freaked out a little bit at the very concept.
Well, I think it also became technically illegal when they had bans on actually testing in space. There was like international
that's right.
signed. Yeah,
the 1963 Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty effectively shut down the program, and President Kennedy himself sort of went, oh, well, if we're saying we can't let off explosions in space, we can't really power a ship with explosions. But the idea of using external nuclear devices is still considered viable, but most current plans revolve around the use of very small fission pellets or tiny little bombs or various fusion-based propulsion systems, both of which are basically beyond our current technology. So
Project Daedalus, one of those?
Daedalus is one of the ones that is sort of went well into the 70s, I think.
Okay.
But again, the technology never quite made it up there to make it viable.
And there are sort of quasi-nuclear powered spacecraft out there. I think they mostly just use radioactive material to generate electricity. You might have seen one in the movie The Martian. I think Matt Damon goes and finds an old plutonium sort of power source that he uses to heat his moon rover. Yeah,
to heat his greenhouse where he was growing potatoes.
Potatoes.
Are you saying that's a reality? No.
No, they're
nuclear powered space vehicles,
but they're not like a bomb or a reactor or something like that. They're actually just generally a bit of radioactive material.
Yeah, the Orion thing was all about using the actual physical blast for acceleration, whereas these ones are getting power from decay of radioactive elements.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. But what I found interesting was that the original Orion concepts were based on existing and tested technology. All the way back in the early 1960s. And they could have actually worked. Theoretically, they could have actually been able to do this.
And by now, they'd be into how many generations? The second generation at least.
Well, they'd be well into they'd be halfway through their journey just about.
Right.
If they sent someone off to Alpha Centauri.
Think of all the things they would have missed. Internet.
They might have developed their own.
You'd
want to send some. You'd want to send some pretty smart people to do a century-long mission. I would think.
Yeah.
But look, Carl Sagan even went so far as to suggest that he couldn't think of a better way to use all of the existing nuclear devices already built than to send craft into deep space. He just thought, what else are we going to do with these nuclear weapons? We might as well use them for something useful. I guess, I think that I kind of think back to my childhood and the pictures in those old books. And at the time when they made these books, they probably seemed like a lot more achievable because people were aware of these kind of projects going on and probably thought just around the corner we'll be all piling into a spaceship to head off to Alpha Centauri or Mars or, the moons of Jupiter or something like that. So even though we're actually no closer in practical terms to being able to travel to other habitable planets, it is kind of cool to know that if someone really wanted to, they could potentially at least get their genes to another planet. Across Australia on the Community Radio Network, you're listening to Lost in Science.
When someone says something is significant, what does it mean to you?
It means a lot.
Yeah, and it totally depends on the context.
Well, you often hear a lot of it in scientific news articles. Like you see here, it's something in the news say scientists have found a significant, or something increases your risk significantly, or there is a significant effect from this particular treatment. And it can be a little confusing what it actually means. I went to, like any good kind of story, I went to the dictionary and looked up what significant means.
The Oxford Dictionary
Actually,
defines.
pretty much. The Oxford Dictionary, as you say, it says it is an adjective. Its first definition it gives is means sufficiently great or important to be worthy of attention or noteworthy, which I think is what most people think of significant meaning. It's something it's important, it's noteworthy. Although their second meaning there was basically just it means that it has a particular meaning, and they give an example of suggesting a meaning or message that's not explicitly stated, as in she gave him a significant look.
Nice significant look, Chris.
Yeah, thanks. But now, most people will think of significant means it's important, because that's kind of what significant means in the everyday parlance.
Yeah.
But in science, when we say
science parlance,
it basically means that it is a result that's considered that it's likely to be true.
Yeah, and important as well. I mean, it's the same.
Well, it's not necessarily, depending what you mean by important. It really means that it's likely to be true. So what it means is that this thing called the p-value, which is a technically thing. The p-value is
just a probability.
The p-value is a probability of getting the result you got. Where if the null hypothesis is true. So if basically you've got a hypothesis, you're testing a hypothesis, and the probability of getting the results that you got if your hypothesis was false, that is kind of the p-value. And so if that p-value is less than some predetermined level that you've agreed that it's going to be, so the probability of it being, essentially probability of being false is less than a certain level, then you say this is a significant result.
It's usually set at, 0.05 is
a
general rule?
That's what a lot of medical research and a lot of research uses. So to give an example, the way it's often used, is at 0.05. And so the way it's often expressed, they don't normally give the actual probability as such. They'll give you, say, the 95% chance it's in a certain range. So a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the study that said potatoes will give you high blood pressure. And they said that there was an effect of an 11% increase. So a 1.11 was the amount that it was sort of the multiplier of eating potatoes to give you high blood pressure. But they had said it was 95% confidence interval of between 0.96 and 1.28. Okay, so that's their statistical significance level is between those two numbers, 0.96 and 1.28. And my argument that I went off about potatoes in that story was that range overlaps the number 1, which basically is a null result. So this result actually wasn't statistically significant because it kind of, had the null hypothesis was completely compatible with this particular 95% confidence interval.
You could have actually got the results from that just from random chance.
Yeah. Now, in that one, where it gets into, though, significance, I'll come back to what that actually means as well, though. But the other side of things, whether it's important or not, this is where it starts to get a bit more complicated. So when I said there was that 11%, that 1.11 figure, that was the hazard ratio. So it basically, the ratio of the hazard ratio, also known as the relative risk ratio, of potatoes will increase your risk of high blood pressure by 11%, by multiply the risk by 1.11. Okay. Now, that doesn't necessarily equate to a big result, depending on what we're talking about here. So people often look at something called absolute risk as well, which is the amount that it actually will affect you. So to give an example, you might have heard last year there was a whole kind of furore about whether processed meat gives you cancer. Eating processed meat gives you cancer. It was declared as...
Headlines such as bacon causes cancer, stop eating it, were bandied around.
Essentially, yeah. Now, this was released by the IARC, which is the International Association for Cancer Research, or something like that, but it's in French, which is why the letters are backwards. And one of the things they determined was that the relative risk is an 18% increase in risk of getting bowel cancer for eating 50 grams of processed meat every day. So 18% increase sounds like a lot. Okay, so that's the relative risk ratio. However, bowel cancer is not it is the second most commonly diagnosed cancer in Australia, but it is still not that common. It's about an 8% chance of being diagnosed with bowel cancer by the time you're age 85. Yeah. So about 7.9%, shall we say. So when you actually look at what that 18% equates to, it's increasing your risk from 7.9% to 9.3%. So the absolute risk then people would give this is 1.4%. Suddenly doesn't sound as big a deal as 18%, does it? So, and this is the kind of thing that people need to consider when they look at these things is, what is the absolute risk of it? Is it worth the actual intervention? In this case, it's up to the individual to decide whether that 1.4% increase is worth giving up bacon for.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, if you had a family history of bowel cancer or something like that, then you might consider that to be significant enough to...
Absolutely.
To
you
cut out the
significant,
bacon.
didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
I slipped into it.
But it does give you an idea of the difference between important and significant, because sometimes you'll have a result that is significant in a statistical sense, but is not necessarily important in what it means for health or that sort of thing. But there is another aspect to it as well. So, as we said, we get back into what this actually means with this definition of statistical significance, which is this 95% sort of probability, effectively. So that sounds pretty good, 95%. It sounds
Sounds
pretty
very
good chance.
Yeah. And so that means that there's a 5% chance of it being outside that, or basically a 1 in 20 that is outside that range, that 95% range. Now let's take an example which I got from Wikipedia. I won't claim this is my own. But supposing you roll a pair of dice and it comes up with double six.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now there is a 1 in 36 chance of you getting a double six when you roll a pair of dice. So that is below our 1 in 20, our 5% sort of outside a range for our confidence interval. So just saying this for this 95% confidence, we would say, those dice are clearly fixed because they cannot double six. But, you can get double six when you roll a pair of dice. Doesn't mean they're loaded. So you kind of need to look beyond just the pure kind of statistics in this to look at the value of one of these studies. You have to look at things like the size of the study, how much data there actually was, and to get a good idea of whether you can actually believe this statistical significance or not.
How many times are you rolling the dice?
Exactly. But I could give that result and say it is 95% confident that these dice are loaded. But I've only rolled them once. The context of
Dodgy
it,
science,
the size of the
Chris.
experiment has an impact as well. Now, you call me dodgy. I am a physicist, as you know.
Dodgy.
And physicists, we go a bit further than that. We use a sort of a level called 5 sigma, which is 5 standard deviations, which basically is a 1 in 3.5 million chance of it being wrong. Your discovery being wrong. This is what they use for things like the Higgs boson and gravitational waves. Now, 1 in 3.5 million, that's pretty good. It's not quite as long as the odds of winning Tats Lotto, but it's still it's still what we use as physicists. Unfortunately, that's because we're doing things like big particle accelerator experiments. We're sending like millions of particles around a tube. Medical research obviously has a few more restrictions. You haven't got as many patients as the millions of particles. The effects aren't necessarily as clear cut as you said. There are often a lot of confounders. There are people's genetic profile. There's a lot of other things cause it. There's not usually one single thing that causes any one particular disease.
Also ethical considerations, because you can't have a control group where you don't help them at all.
Yeah.
Well, those kind of things, yeah. And you can't put them in a accelerator in Switzerland. You can't put your patients in that and zip them around.
As much as you physicists want to.
No, we try to. Look, the takeaway is basically that when a science report says a result is significant, that doesn't necessarily mean it's important. It just means that it's statistically likely, and even then, it might not even be true.
You're traveling through another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. That's the signpost up ahead. Your next stop.
Lost in Science.
How will climate change affect the health and welfare of our most beloved pets? This is a topic we don't talk about much, but in Adelaide last month, the Australian Veterinarian Association came together for their annual conference, and a main focus of the event was just this. I have with me today Dr. Guy Weerasinghe from the Australian Veterinarians in Public Health, who was one of the organisers of the workshop. Welcome to Lost in Science, Guy.
G'day, how are we going?
Very well. So, Guy, can you let us know what are the main sort of health and welfare issues that will be facing our pets as the climate changes?
Okay, so in terms of climate change's impact on pets, I have to always preface this is that we don't have any systems really that are currently good at capturing this data. But
Right.
there are people who are working on better surveillance systems in small animal veterinary practice. But what I can talk about is that we know that pets are impacted by storms. There's a lot of cats and dogs that have got a lot of storm phobia. And
Absolutely.
we know that climate change intensifies the storms. So we are now passing on the message to a lot of our, all pet owners in Australia, how to look after their pets during intense storms.
And what sort of messages are you trying to get out there?
I guess the big things for me are to make sure that every pet is microchipped, that every client knows what to look for in terms of identifying storm phobia, because as a pet gets older, the storm phobia behaviour actually intensifies and just gets more and more, I guess, outward. I had this one situation where a golden retriever, really old golden retriever, had such bad storm phobia, pretty much barreled through a fence and ripped its two canines on its lower jaw out. And I had to,
Oh my
luckily
goodness.
these clients were really lovely, brought the dog straight away, and I was able to at least surgically repair that, pull the teeth out, but had to surgically repair that jaw. I guess that's an example, like a horrible example, but it's an example of just how scary storms are for pets. And so the early signs I tell people to watch out for are like really dilated pupils, licking the lips, pacing, trying to hide under things. Those are some of the very early signs that you can spot out early. And I recommend that people should be going and speaking to their veterinarians and coming up with a plan for what to do when a storm is about to hit. It's better that way rather than the alternative where after the storm has occurred, you've already seen the damage that's occurred to your pet.
I mean, this is something that needs talking about with the wider community, but also the wider veterinarian community. And that's something you have been doing at a workshop in Adelaide recently. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. We recently held our One Health and the Impact of Climate Change workshop. So One Health is that interface between human health, animal health and environmental health. And we sort of operate in that intersection of all things One Health. And so we had a few experts come down, like Professor Mark Howden, who is part of the Climate Change Institute at ANU. We had Dr. Peter Heyman, who's from the South Australian Research and Development Institute. We had Associate Professor Craig Williams, who does a lot of work with diseases that are transmitted by vectors like mosquitoes. And we had Professor Colin Butler, who's a medico, who is part of the Centre for Research and Action in Public Health from the University of Canberra. And they all just came and pretty much laid out the situation of how climate change is impacting health in terms of human health as well as agricultural health and vector-borne diseases.
And how did that workshop come about?
So this workshop, it sort of came about because So I used to be the president of the Public Health Special Interest Group under the Australian Veterinary Association, and we were talking a lot about climate change, and we were saying, this is a public health issue, this is an issue for animal health and animal welfare, so let's start working on a position statement, let's start having more conversations about that. And we decided, look, you know what, let's start bring some of these experts together and provide us at least what the facts are in the situation, so a lot of our vets can have that kind of knowledge in the back of their head, and they can start thinking about research ideas. I'm a bit of a research nerd, so for me, I want more research occurring.
And you mentioned about a statement. So are you putting these findings together into a statement that's going to be released publicly, or?
That is the hope. Now, I can't go into great depth about what the position statement is going to entail because it's still in draft mode, but the big punchy bits that we like talking about is just saying, climate change is happening. We're not going to get into the debate about it because that's just encouraging the denialists. But to talk about where we consider climate change is going to be a risk factor to animal health, welfare and production. So things like vector-borne diseases. There's a lot of diseases that happen in animals that are transmitted by biting midges or mosquitoes. And climate change is something which we know which will, be a factor in moving these populations around. Like we've seen in Canada, new diseases coming in with the movement of different reindeers and tick species moving up further north. So we're worried about how's that going to impact on Australian animal health and welfare? Other areas of concern for us from a veterinary perspective are things like food security and safety. So are we able to sustain the level of agricultural production with climate change in play, or do we need to start thinking about different methods of adapting? So we're sort of raising that as a subject that is critical in the agricultural world. Things like ecosystems health. Did you guys ever discuss the paper that came out last year by Urban from Science, I think, about species extinction due to climate change?
I can't remember us specifically speaking about that paper, so maybe briefly update us, yeah.
So it was a paper, that was a really nice paper. It was like a meta-analysis which combined quite a few papers together and identified what areas are going to be at most risk due to climate change. And Urban had pointed out that we're going to be seeing species extinction in very climate niche areas, in particular South America and Australia.
Right, that's a huge finding.
Yes. So being an epidemiology nerd, I quite like reading these kinds of papers because it's all nice to sort of focus on just a single paper and just go, yep, that's a real main finding. But when you sort of bring it all together, it paints a much nicer, or in this case, a scarier picture, and sort of, for me, it provides me the drive for saying this is a critical issue that we need to be talking about.
What advice, Guy, can you give to pet owners in the community at this point in time about how they can help their pets or their livestock or even wildlife?
I guess my main piece of advice would be, if you are having a pet that is more prone to heat stress or storm phobia or is at risk due to flooding, go and have a chat to your veterinarian.
Mm-hmm.
Plan things way in advance. Like I always tell a lot of my clients who have dogs that have got storm phobia, the Bureau of Meteorology is your friend. Be on that website all the time, know when your storms are coming, and then plan ahead. When it comes to heat stress situations with pets, know how to treat your pet very early and then rush them into the clinic when you feel like they are having, or when you suspect they might be having heat stress. In terms of droughts or flooding in farming, well, you have to, a lot of my farmers have been very much, following the Bureau, and they know their weather better than I do. And they'll always plan for where they're going to move their cattle in times of flooding, so that there are mounds where they can move up onto so that they're not going to be at risk of drowning. I've got farmers who are dairy farmers who will now install sprinkler systems, so when the cattle come in for getting milked, that they'll be covered in water so that they're going to be cooling down a lot more. They'll also be changing, so a lot of farmers are now changing where they're going to be when they are milking their cows. So it's going to be earlier in the day and later in the evening, so it's less risk of heat stressing those cows.
And how about wildlife, from a wildlife perspective?
Wildlife, that's a huge area. I mean,
Yeah.
Bats are so heat sensitive. I know that one of your presenters really loves the bats.
Manisha, she's doing a PhD on them. She loves them that much.
So we know that bats are really at risk, and we're even, like, there was a paper that came out in May this year in Science about how red knot birds, so these are birds that are up in the Arctic, due to climate change, they're actually getting smaller in size and shorter bills. We know that wildlife are going to be impacted, so I guess what do we do? Where do we start? Follow the papers, have a chat with the ecologist. Everyone should be aware of just how at risk a lot of these species are.
Thank you so much for talking to us today, Guy, and thanks for giving us some really sort of tangible advice for things to be aware of and how we can help our pets and our livestock and wildlife about the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, no worries.
That's all we've got time for on this episode of Lost in Science. Thanks for tuning in and joining us. Lost in Science is recorded at the studios of 3CR in Melbourne and broadcast across Australia on the Community Radio Network with the financial assistance of the Community Broadcasting Foundation. If you want to talk to us, talk back to us, you can get in touch. We have a Gmail account, lostinsight@gmail. You can also find us on Twitter and on the Facebook. And if that's not enough, Lost in Science for you can always tune in again next week, where the team will once again get lost in science!
Thanks for listening to a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online.